Alex and I had been friends since childhood. We went to school together, experienced our first disappointments, and celebrated our first victories. As we turned 25, we began to dream of one thing, a big adventure. Alex and I often talked about how it was time to see the world. Everything kept getting postponed. First work, then family, but eventually we found the time and picked a destination, a secluded island on the other side of the world. It was far from civilization, with turquoise waters and pristine beaches. We bought tickets, booked a cottage by the ocean, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. But just a few days before the trip, strange things began happening which I didn't take seriously at the time. A few days before our departure, I started noticing odd little things. First, I received several calls from unknown numbers, and every time I answered, there was silence on the other end. I attributed this to normal system glitches, but deep down, something began to disturb me. One night, I had a strange dream. In it, Alex was standing on a deserted beach, and the ocean was black as tar. I approached him, calling his name, but he wouldn't turn around. I yelled over and over, but he just stood there motionless. When I finally touched his shoulder, he turned and his eyes were empty, lifeless. I woke up in a cold sweat. That dream lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake off the oppressive feeling that something was wrong. During the day, Alex came over and we discussed our upcoming vacation again. I didn't tell him about the dream. I didn't want to sound foolish, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. Alex was in great spirits, joking and expressing how much he was looking forward to the trip. At that moment, I decided that it was just pre-vacation nerves. The next morning, I was hit by another unsettling event. I woke up with sharp pain in my abdomen. It felt like a sharp needle pierced me every time I tried to get out of bed. The doctor said I had appendicitis. I could forget about the trip. The operation went well, but I was strictly forbidden to fly. Alex was disappointed but didn't cancel his trip. He joked that he would come back and show me 1,000 photos. We said our goodbyes, and I saw him off to the airport. At that moment, I didn't know I was seeing him for the last time. Alex flew away, and I was left to recover from surgery. A few days went by, and everything was calm until I noticed he hadn't been in touch. At first, I thought it was normal. He was relaxing and enjoying nature, but soon I started to worry. We usually stayed in touch, especially during trips. I tried calling, but his phone was out of service. I began sending him messages, but they remained unread. A week passed, and there was still no news from Alex. I called the travel agency where we had booked the cottage, but they said Alex had never shown up. My worry turned into panic. I tried contacting the police, but they told me there was nothing they could do without proof that something was wrong. With each passing day, my anxiety grew. What could have happened to Alex? Why hadn't he shown up on the island? Why hadn't he contacted anyone? These questions drove me crazy. I tried to find answers, but nothing worked. My mind started racing with the most horrific scenarios. Maybe he had an accident on the way. Maybe he was kidnapped. What weighed on me the most was the strange feeling that my illness, this case of appendicitis, somehow saved my life. As if some force didn't want me to go on this trip. And the more I thought about it, the more real that thought seemed. The dreams grew worse. Alex appeared to me again, standing on the black shore with empty eyes. Sometimes he called my name. His voice was soft, almost drowned out by the sound of the waves, but I heard every word. "You should have gone," he whispered, and there was reproach in his voice. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I contacted private detectives and decided to go to the island myself to find out what had happened. It was the longest flight of my life. I couldn't calm down. My thoughts raced one after another. I expected the worst, but when I landed, it turned out that no one knew about my friend, at least officially. Tourists spoke of a man who had left the cottage several days ago and disappeared into the jungle. But there were no traces, no reports. It was as if Alex had simply evaporated. I wandered around the island for days trying to find any sign of him. The locals just shrugged their shoulders when I asked about him. Everything seemed to indicate that Alex never existed at all. However, on the 4th day of searching, I stumbled upon an old fisherman's hut at the edge of the forest. Inside, it was dark and damp, but in the corner lay something that filled me with cold terror. It was our shared photograph taken just days before the trip. On the back was a short but sinister note. You should have gone instead of him. I left the island without ever finding him. Years passed, but I still don't know what happened to Alex. I know one thing. If I had gone on that trip, I would not have come back. I opened the door and stepped inside the house, dropping my backpack by the entrance as usual. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to relax. Normally at this time, Max, my younger brother, would already be home. It had become routine. I always knew I'd find him, either in his room or in the kitchen, but today the house was eerily quiet. It unsettled me for a moment, but I quickly brushed off the feeling. Maybe he was just caught up in a computer game in his room and didn't hear me come in. As I walked down the hallway, I called out, "Max!" There was no reply. I headed upstairs, but when I peeked into his room, it was empty. His school backpack wasn't there either, which surprised me a little. He must have forgotten it at a friend's house, I thought. I returned to my room, opened my laptop, and started working on my homework. A few minutes passed when suddenly I heard Max's voice. "Alex." His voice sounded muffled, as if he were calling me from far away. I paused, but didn't react immediately. He did this kind of thing often, calling me just to tease or joke around. I figured it was just one of his silly pranks again. "Alex," he called again, this time louder. I shook my head, annoyed, and got up from my chair, heading downstairs. "All right, let's see what he wants." "All right." But as soon as I stepped onto the first floor, a cold, oppressive feeling washed over me like something had changed in the house. Everything looked the same, but there was an unmistakable heaviness in the air. "Max," I called, but no one answered. I walked through the entire first floor, checked the kitchen, the living room, even the bathroom, but Max was nowhere to be found. And then it hit me. I was alone in the house. My heart stopped. I had heard his voice so clearly, but how could that be if he wasn't home? Panic started to rise, and I headed back toward the stairs when suddenly I heard light footsteps above me. Someone was walking on the second floor. The steps were slow and heavy, but they were definitely there. Maybe he came back. But how? I didn't hear the door open. The thoughts raced through my head, but I forced myself to climb back up. The stairs creaked under my feet, each sound amplified by the eerie silence. When I reached my room, the footsteps abruptly stopped. I stood in the doorway, staring into the darkness of the hallway. Every instinct inside me screamed that something was wrong. I should have left, but instead I stepped deeper into the house, almost on autopilot. The feeling that I wasn't alone became unbearable. Every step echoed loudly. Every noise seemed sharper than it should have been. "Max," I called out again, but this time my voice sounded hollow and strange, as if the house itself was swallowing it. And then the footsteps resumed. This time they were much closer, as if someone were standing right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. My throat went dry and my heart pounded violently in my chest. An unseen force pressed down on my chest. It felt like the shadows on the walls were starting to move. I bolted to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Leaning against the cold wall, I tried to calm my racing heart. The sounds outside the door had gone quiet, but now the house seemed too silent. This ominous quiet felt oppressive, like something was lingering in the air, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The footsteps returned again. This time, they were much clearer, closer, and unnaturally slow. I heard someone stop right outside my door, and then there was silence again. An unnatural, tense silence. My whole body tensed up. I could feel the fear gripping me from head to toe. I closed my eyes and tried to hold my breath, hoping not to give away my presence. But someone was definitely standing outside my door. Minutes passed. The footsteps started again, but this time they were moving away. My heart gradually started to calm down, but I stayed motionless, listening intently to every sound. Suddenly, something heavy fell onto the floor in the hallway with a dull thud. I flinched but didn't dare open the door. Instead, I heard shuffling steps, as if someone was dragging their feet across the floor. After what felt like an eternity, everything went quiet. The house was completely still, and finally I heard the front door open. Voices filled the hallway. My parents and Max had returned home. My mom was cheerfully talking about something, Max was laughing, and I just sat there on the floor, trying to process what had just happened. Gathering all my strength, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Everything seemed normal. Max was already sitting in the living room glued to his phone, and my parents were unpacking groceries in the kitchen. I stood on the stairs looking around, but nothing was out of the ordinary. I wanted to tell them what had happened, but something inside me stopped. I joined them at the table, but remained silent. No one noticed anything strange. No one felt what I had experienced in my absence. The family went about their usual lives as if nothing had changed. But I knew the truth. Whatever had come into the house would come back. And next time, I might not be able to escape so easily. Now every rustle, every gust of wind, every creak of the floor fills me with dread. The feeling hasn't left. It's become a constant companion, and I know that sooner or later it will come for me again. I don't know why I haven't turned in my flight credentials yet. Every time I open an email from the airline asking me to clarify my intentions, whether to quit or return to work, I just close it. I've known the answer for a while now. I'm never flying again. It all started that day during Flight 714 to New York. The flight was smooth except for some mild turbulence over the Atlantic. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was scanning the instruments just like I'd done hundreds of times before, checking the autopilot. Everything was on track, but about 3 hours into the flight, the instruments began acting strangely. Everything looked fine, but there was a tension in the air. Then I heard a faint whisper in my headset, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. "Did you hear that?" I asked my co-pilot, Dan. He shook his head without looking up from his readings. I shrugged it off, trying not to make a big deal of it. A minute later it happened again, a whisper, even closer, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent an icy chill through me. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on fatigue. After all, we all knew how long flights could mess with your nerves. Then something happened with the cabin lights. They flickered, and at that moment I clearly heard a voice behind me whispering, "You're not alone." I whipped around. No one was there. My heart pounded in my chest. It was irrational. There was no one behind me. The cockpit was sealed, secure. No one but me and Dan could be in here. But that feeling, that cold sensation between my shoulder blades, as if something or someone was watching me. "How are you holding up?" Dan glanced at me, a hint of concern in his eyes. "You look pale." I almost told him about the whisper, but the words stuck in my throat. What would he think? Flying for hours with someone who says they're hearing things? No, I couldn't let that happen. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing confidence into my voice. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the tension clung to me. I didn't sleep at the hotel after we landed. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying those words in my head. "You're not alone." It felt so real, as if someone had whispered it right into my ear at that moment. I tried convincing myself it was just my imagination, maybe exhaustion from the long flights catching up to me, but it only got worse when I returned home. Every night, I would hear the same thing, the whisper. It came just as I was about to fall asleep, like someone was standing at the head of my bed, murmuring in my ear. At first it was just random sounds, fragments of words, but soon they started to take shape. "You're not alone. You're not alone. You can't escape." I became more withdrawn. The thought of flying again filled me with dread. I couldn't tell my wife. I couldn't let her see how broken I'd become. She was used to seeing me as the steady one, the person who could handle anything. Weeks passed, and the whispers started invading my daily life. One night, while I was sorting through old flight documents in our dimly lit living room, the desk lamp flickered and the whisper returned. Only this time it was all around me, like a chorus of voices. It felt like there were invisible figures standing in every corner, murmuring in unison. "You're not alone. You can't escape." I jumped up, scanning the empty room, and then something else happened. I felt it. Something touched my shoulder. Cold, unseen fingers. I recoiled, knocking over the desk. The lamp crashed to the floor and went out. I couldn't take it anymore. This darkness, these sounds, this presence. It had become real. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing: I could never fly again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only way to escape whatever was hunting me. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? If I admitted to hearing voices and feeling things that weren't there, I'd lose everything: my job, my family, my sanity. I kept pretending everything was fine, but inside I was hanging by a thread. A month after that flight, the airline called. They said I'd had enough time to recover from my exhaustion, and it was time to come back. I stayed silent as the voice of the senior pilot came through the phone. There was nothing threatening in his words, but my heart pounded like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Jake, are you there?" he asked. "Yeah," I croaked. "I just need more time," he sighed. A long pause followed, and then he said, "I get it, but you need to come back. But don't drag this out." They couldn't wait forever. I knew that if I didn't return, my career would be over. But deep down, I felt that if I got behind the controls again, I might never make it back to the ground. Something was chasing me, and it would get stronger if I went back into the air. But the fear of losing everything I'd worked for was too great. In the end, I made the decision to fly again. I told my wife I needed to take one last flight to clear up all the work-related questions. She believed in me. Her faith was unbearable. I felt like I was betraying her by not telling her the truth. I sat in the cockpit just like I had hundreds of times before. Dan was my co-pilot again. He gave me a curious glance, but said nothing when I took control. The takeoff went smoothly, no issues at all, but inside I was boiling over with dread, waiting for it to start, and then it did. A few hours into the flight, the instruments started flickering. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. Dan looked at me, doubt flickering in his eyes. But before he could say anything, I heard it again. "You're not alone." This time, the voice was clear, like someone was standing right behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second I saw something. A figure standing behind Dan's seat. I blinked and it was gone. Panic seized me. My hands shook on the controls, and I realized I wasn't in control anymore. The voice grew louder, and in that moment, the instruments malfunctioned completely. The autopilot flickered. The alarms in the cockpit grew louder, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from where I'd seen the ghostly figure. "Jake," Dan's voice snapped me back. "What's wrong with you? Jake?" He was shouting, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos inside my mind. Suddenly, the plane banked hard, and the instruments went dead. The warning alarm blared throughout the cabin. I tried to stabilize the plane, but my fingers wouldn't respond. I was certain that if I looked back, I would see the thing that had been whispering to me for all those months. And in that moment, I realized a terrible truth. It was here. It had come for me, and there was no escaping. Seconds stretched into eternity as we fought to regain control of the plane. I don't know how we did it. Maybe it was a miracle, or maybe someone up there decided to give me one last chance. But when we landed on the emergency runway at the airport, I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. All I knew was that I'd never fly again. And this time, it wasn't just fear of flying. Jake sat in silence, staring ahead. The whispering was gone, but he knew it was only temporary. If he ever went back up into the sky, it would return. And next time, it wouldn't let him go. I had been searching for a place to live for a long time when I finally found the perfect option, an old but cozy house on the outskirts of town. Its price was surprisingly low, and the owner, an elderly woman, said the house had been empty for several years but was in good condition. The location was quiet, with no neighbors nearby, and I decided this was a great opportunity to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Everything went well from the moment I moved in. The first few days were spent unpacking boxes and setting up the interior to my liking. The house was dilapidated but had a certain charm. Creaky floors, old wooden panels, and heavy curtains hanging in the windows. It felt like the perfect retreat, a sanctuary from the constant noise of the metropolis. But then the oddities began. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard someone quietly walking down the hallway. The floorboards creaked distinctly and slowly, as if someone was carefully stepping, not wanting to wake me. I froze. At first I thought it was rats. Maybe the house hadn't been cleaned in a while. But the sound was too heavy for a rodent. I mustered the courage to get out of my room and check the house, but found no one. The next day I decided not to dwell on it. I convinced myself it was just the old house making noises. But the strangeness continued. Items began changing locations. Every morning, I would wake up to find books I left on the table, on the floor, or rearranged in a different order. Sometimes I found windows open, even though I knew I had closed them at night. Every night I felt a presence in the house. It wasn't that I heard footsteps, but there was a strange heaviness in the air. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me. As strange as it sounds, I began to feel that the house was alive, observing me, judging me. One evening, while I was reading in the living room, I heard the chandelier in the hallway jingle. The sound was quiet but distinct. I looked up and saw it swaying slightly, even though all the doors and windows were closed. My heart raced, but I once again convinced myself it was just the wind or that the house was breathing as old buildings sometimes do. A week passed, and I began to notice a peculiar habit developing. Every time I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I would stop to look at my reflection. Not because I suspected anything, but because something always seemed off in the mirror. Sometimes, when I looked into it, I felt as if my reflection lingered a second longer than it should, or the corner of the room I saw behind me looked different than it actually was. The climax of it all happened that night. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a door slamming. It was a distinct sound, as if someone had closed a door. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound repeated. At that moment, I realized someone or something was in the house. I got out of bed and slowly ventured into the hallway. The silence was deafening, but as I approached the stairs leading to the first floor, I saw light. A small, barely noticeable light glowing at the end of the hallway where there were no lamps or windows. I took a step forward and suddenly the light vanished. It was as if it simply dissolved into the darkness. But at that same moment, I heard heavy breathing behind me. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the floorboards. It was alive, slow, and threatening breathing. I didn't have time to turn around before I felt an icy chill on my neck. I bolted back to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. But even then, I could hear the breathing. It was right behind the door. I stood there holding my breath, afraid to move. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it would echo throughout the neighborhood. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, that I was too tired, and my mind refused to accept reality. Several hours passed before I finally worked up the courage to leave. The house was empty, but since then, I could no longer ignore what was happening. This place wasn't ordinary. It was watching me, testing my limits, probing my fears. Every time I returned home, I felt as if someone was waiting for me. I noticed the neighbors didn't pay me any attention, as if no one cared. I began to feel isolated not only from people but from the house itself. It felt as though it had decided I didn't belong there, that I was an outsider. After a week, I packed my things and moved out. I could no longer stay in that house, and although I left it behind, the feeling of being watched hasn't left me since. It's as if the house left a part of itself inside me. Now I often look into mirrors, hoping I won't see anything strange. Every time I pass by old buildings, I feel as though they are watching me. When I think about that house, I realize it was more than just a structure made of wood and concrete. It was something greater, something alive. I can feel its shadow stretching behind me, as if I will never be able to escape it. The moment I left, I didn't realize it had taken a part of me with it. And every evening when darkness falls, I hear its breathing in the silence, knowing that it is still there, waiting, watching. And every time I close my eyes, I feel like I can hear its whisper calling me back. One evening, as silence enveloped my room, I sat at my desk, lost in thought. It had been 2 years since my best friend Alex tragically passed away, yet his absence lingered in every corner of my home. We had been inseparable since childhood, exploring abandoned places together, laughing and dreaming of the future. That evening, I felt particularly alone. Suddenly, a crackling sound broke the stillness. My phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from one of my friends. Instead, my breath caught in my throat. The sender was Alex. How is this possible? Raced through my mind. I stared at the screen, unable to believe my eyes. The message read, "I need your help." My heart raced and a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard Alex's voice in so long, hadn't seen his face since that terrible day. It felt impossible. Taking a deep breath, I touched the screen, my fingers trembling. I replied, "Is it really you?" Seconds dragged on, feeling like an eternity, before his name appeared on the screen again. "Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't want it to be like this." My heart raced even faster. I typed, "What do you mean? I'm trapped. You need to save me." I froze. How could he be trapped? He was dead. We always joked that our fears were left in childhood, but this was no laughing matter. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The silence in the room felt suffocating. "Where are you?" I typed, my hands shaking. "In the old house. You have to come." The old house. I remembered how Alex and I used to explore it as kids, laughing and encouraging each other to go inside. It wasn't just a house. It was our memories intertwined with childhood fears. It had been abandoned for years, and I could never forget the eerie sounds that echoed there. My instincts screamed for me not to go, but another part of me felt an inexplicable pull. "I'll come," I replied, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I grabbed my jacket and quickly put on my shoes, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive to the house felt like an eternity. The streets were strangely empty, the streetlights casting long shadows that danced in the dark. I kept glancing back, unable to believe I had decided to do this. Every rustle seemed ominous, urging me to hurry. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do this. When I finally arrived at the old house, it loomed before me, dark and foreboding. I hesitated at the entrance, memories swirling in my mind, laughter, games, promises of adventure. I pushed the door open, and it creaked as if warning me of something. The air was thick with dust and silence, and I felt my old fears awaken within me. I pulled out my phone, its screen illuminating the darkness around me. "Alex," I called softly. In the basement came the message. My heart raced even faster. I remembered the basement, the place we both feared as kids, filled with shadows and whispers of ghosts. With every step down the narrow staircase creaking under my weight, I felt fear engulf me. The air grew colder and I shivered as I reached the bottom. "I'm here," I whispered, hoping for a response. "Watch your back." The message appeared on the screen. My heart pounded. I slowly turned, scanning the dimly lit space. Nothing. Just shadows. "Alex," I called, panic rising in my voice. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze pass through me, chilling me to the bone. The temperature dropped even lower. I turned back to my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed, I'm scared. You have to leave. They're coming." Fear gripped me. "Who's coming?" I asked, but no answer followed. Instead, the air around me thickened, and I heard faint whispers echoing in the darkness. I felt something ominous approaching. I knew I had to get out. As I turned to flee up the stairs, my phone screen flickered, displaying a single message. "I'm sorry." I bolted up the stairs, my heart racing. I felt a heavy presence behind me, as if a dark shadow was following my every move. I stumbled as I reached the top landing, throwing myself at the door. I could sense something clawing at the edges of my consciousness, something that wanted me to stay. With one last effort, I shoved the door open and stumbled into the night. I ran without looking back, the whispers fading as I made it home. Once in my room, I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. I glanced at my phone, my heart racing. The screen was black. No messages, no signs of anything. Days passed without another message from Alex. I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, but deep down I knew I had experienced something supernatural. I began to feel as if something was stalking me, an oppressive sensation that Alex was trying to reach me. Then one night, I heard the notification sound on my phone again. I picked it up, and my heart sank. I had a new message. "Thank you for coming." In that moment, I realized I had let something dark into my life, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. My reflection in the screen didn't look like it used to. My eyes held a spark of fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex was really here, somewhere nearby. I knew I had to make a choice. Ignore his call or venture once more into the dark depths of memories I had always run from. And though I knew I should leave, I couldn't bring myself to leave the room. Every time I closed my eyes, the shadow passed by, whispering his name, as if promising that if I didn't go to him, he would find me himself. From that moment on, I understood that time stretches, and not only darkness comes to it, but also an expectation. And that expectation was unbearable. Every evening coming home from work, I felt a strange tension in the air. I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. At first, I thought it was just stress. A noisy day at the office, long hours behind the computer, anyone would start having intrusive thoughts. But one night, lying in bed, I heard it for the first time. A quiet creak, as if someone was carefully stepping on the floor. I froze, listening to the darkness. The apartment was too quiet, and the sound seemed especially loud. I mentally laughed at myself. Probably just the house settling. I imagined an old haunted house like in the movies, but my home wasn't old at all, and definitely not haunted. Yet, the next night, the sound returned. The creak was short, as if someone was standing nearby, afraid to take the next step. I got up from bed and walked through the entire apartment. No signs of a break-in. The windows and doors were closed. No traces, no visitors. I sighed with relief, blaming my exhaustion. A week passed. The creaks became more insistent. Now I even heard them during the day when I came back home. One evening I felt a gaze on my back. I turned around, but of course there was no one there. Just shadows from the streetlights falling on the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves, but a voice inside kept telling me something was wrong. The following night I made a decision. I left the light on in the bedroom and set my phone to record while I slept. Waking up in the morning, I felt a tense unease, as if my room was filled with invisible electricity. I pressed play and my heart skipped a beat. On the recording, I heard that same creak, but this time it was followed by a faint, barely audible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded sinister, unnatural. I rewound the recording several times, hoping to convince myself it was just interference. But each time the voice grew clearer, as if someone had been in my room. At work, I couldn't concentrate. Thoughts about that voice spun in my head, and I tried to find a logical explanation. Could someone have been hiding in my apartment? I decided to check every corner, every closet, but found nothing. That evening, I only managed to fall asleep at dawn, forcing myself to believe it was all just my imagination. But the next evening, everything changed. Coming home, I noticed that the wardrobe doors in the bedroom were wide open. I was sure I had closed them in the morning. I slowly approached the wardrobe, unsure of what to expect. Inside, it was empty, but something strange caught my eye. A corner of the floor bore scratches, as if someone had tried to scratch something from the inside. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe I had just forgotten to close them, but those scratches... I brushed off the thoughts and closed the wardrobes, trying not to think about it. That night, the same creak woke me up. This time it came from right outside my bedroom door. At that moment, I felt real fear. I slowly turned on the light and froze. The bedroom door was ajar, even though I remembered locking it before bed. Suddenly, a quiet whisper came from behind the door. It was the same as on the recording, but now I could hear it clearly. The voice said my name. It wasn't loud, more like someone had whispered it directly into my mind. A chill ran through my body and my heart pounded wildly. I leapt from the bed and locked the door in one swift motion. I sat on the floor, listening to the silence beyond the door. Now there was nothing, only a ringing stillness. I gathered the courage to peek through the gap under the door, and what I saw made my heart stop. There, in the darkness of the hallway on the floor, lay a shadow. It wasn't moving, but its shape was wrong, as if it belonged to something that shouldn't exist. I tried to call the police, but the line was busy. In a panic, I began typing a message to a friend, but before I could send it, the light flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. A whisper came from behind the door again, now louder, as if someone was right outside. I locked myself in the bathroom and stayed there until morning. When the light finally broke through the window, I came out, but everything in the apartment was in its place. I checked the recording on my phone, but now it was empty, no creaks, no voices. But I knew it was real. Every evening after that, I began to feel more paranoid. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The whisper didn't return, but I knew it was somewhere close. A week went by, and I decided to stay with friends until I could figure out what was happening. But on the last evening, while packing my things, I noticed something strange on the floor near the bedroom. It was a tiny scrap of paper covered in dirty fingerprints. On it was written, "You can't leave." I burned the note that very evening, but the feeling that something had stayed with me never went away. Now, even though I live somewhere else, I continue to feel the silence that creeps up on me at night, and sometimes, in the darkness, I think I hear that same whisper calling my name. Every night, I fall asleep with the sense that something unseen is moving in the shadows, not in my home, but next to me, inside. I begin to understand that it wasn't just the apartment. Something is watching me, stalking, waiting for me to let my guard down. And every time I hear it, I know it's only a matter of time before the shadow finds me again. Working in the emergency services demanded not only resilience but also constant readiness for anything. Night shifts meant staying alert, prepared for any call. Sometimes it was routine stuff, lost hikers or broken down cars, but this call was different from all the others. It came in the dead of night, when the sky was shrouded in clouds and not a sliver of moonlight pierced the darkness. The distress signal broke the silence, and I quickly picked up. A faint voice, barely discernible through the static, crackled over the line. "Please, help. We're in the woods. Can't find our way back." My fingers tightened around the phone. Panic seeped through the caller's voice, clawing its way under my skin. I asked quickly, "Can you give me your location? Where exactly are you?" There was no immediate response. Just silence, broken by the sound of static and a strange rustling, like someone moving in the background. Finally, the voice returned, now even more fearful. "We're in the woods. Feels like someone's here, watching us." A sense of unease twisted in my gut. Trying to keep my voice steady, I urged them to stay on the line and not move while I contacted the local search and rescue teams. But before I could relay the information, the call abruptly dropped. I tried to call back, but all I heard were dull, distorted noises as if something was interfering with the signal. The next morning, I reported everything to the police and local rescue teams. A search party was dispatched to the area described by the caller, but not a trace was found. No people, no signs of struggle, no vehicle. It was as if the call had been a phantom, vanishing into the night. Some of my colleagues tried to convince me it might have been a prank or a glitch in the system, but I knew what I had heard, the genuine fear in that voice. A week went by and I had nearly pushed the incident from my mind until one evening my personal phone rang. It was the same voice, but now it was barely more than a whisper, as if the person was on the brink of exhaustion. "We found a house. It won't let us leave." "What? What house? Where are you?" I desperately tried to get more information, but the call cut off again. That short conversation left a deep sense of dread gnawing at me. I realized then that I couldn't just sit and do nothing. I had to find out what was happening. The next day, I decided to head into the woods myself. I took a map, a flashlight, and a radio, navigating through the thick underbrush, following the descriptions from that troubling call. The forest seemed to absorb the sound of my footsteps, and the silence around me was oppressive. After several miles, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated house. Its walls were overgrown with moss, windows shattered, and part of the roof had caved in. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet there were no signs of recent human activity. I looked around but found no traces of people. Nothing that suggested anyone had been there recently. The door creaked open slightly in the wind. Steeling myself with my flashlight, I stepped inside, immediately engulfed by the chill that seeped through even my thick clothes. Inside, the house reeked of damp and decay. Peeling wallpaper clung to the walls, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. I searched the rooms, trying not to miss a single detail, until I stumbled upon an old radio set, gathering dust in a corner. It seemed broken, but when I touched it, the device suddenly crackled to life. The same voice came through the speakers. "Please help us. We're in the house. It won't let us leave." At that moment, the air around me grew heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as the voice faded out, and I sensed something behind me. Turning, I saw a blurry figure standing in the doorway. Its outline was indistinct, like mist, but I recognized it as the person whose voice had haunted my nights. They reached out towards me, their eyes filled with despair and terror. I took a step back, but in that instant, they vanished, as if dissolving into thin air. I bolted for the exit, ignoring the creaking beneath my feet, and burst outside, gulping down the frigid night air. As I sped down the road in my car, I allowed myself a moment of relief, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw that same figure standing by the roadside, watching me. Their eyes glowed in the reflection of my headlights, and I floored the accelerator, trying to get as far away from that place as possible. After that night, I never received another call. But sometimes, sitting in my apartment at night, I still hear that faint, broken voice through the static on my radio, pleading for help. It grows fainter each time, as if it's receding into the depths of the forest beyond my reach. And every time I hear it, I think of that abandoned house It seems like the house, wherever it may be, is still out there, waiting for those who might stumble upon its threshold. Months passed, but the feeling that I missed something crucial never left me. I gathered my courage to return to that place, but I could no longer find it. The forest remained silent, swallowed by cold and mist. The house had vanished as if it had never existed, and yet sometimes I swear I catch a glimpse of it among the trees just beyond the next bend. It's like it's luring me back, knowing that one day I won't be able to resist and will step inside its walls.